I have to admit, it comes as some surprise to me, but I'm beginning to realize that I'm kind of an old man. Part of what's caused this increased awareness is not the sagging skin or the aching bones or the gray hair or the clothes hanging awkwardly off my increasingly fragile frame. It's in fact the leaked Supreme Court decision that effectively does away with tens of millions of women's rights over their own bodies. You see, I was fortunate enough to march and fight with my sisters and brothers for women's rights in 1972. And 50 long years ago. And now, in 2022, I will march and fight for women's rights, including their right to choose what goes on in their own body. You know, a lot of things happen over time. Over 200 years ago, Olympe de Gouges wrote her Declaration of Women's Rights during the French Revolution. And Mary Wollstonecraft jump-started what would eventually become the first wave of the women's rights movement in England and the United States in 1792, when she published her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. De Gouges was then tried for treason in France and executed. Mary died a few years later, days after the birth of her daughter, Mary Shelley, who was conceived out of wedlock. Almost 200 years ago, in the late 1820s, the Grimke sisters started their speaking campaign for abolition and women's rights. Over 170 years ago, in 1848, women and male allies came together in Seneca Falls, New York, to create the Declaration of Women's Rights for the United States. 3 years later, in 1851, Sojourner Truth made her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech in Akron, Ohio. The modern fight for women's rights has been a long, arduous journey. It's been over 100 years since Emma Goldman went to jail for advocating that a woman need not keep her mouth shut and her womb open. And Margaret Sanger was put on trial for advocating birth control through the mail. When women finally got the vote in 1920, it had been about 50 years since black men had had that right, and about 100 years since virtually all white men received that right. Sexual harassment was the subject of humor throughout our history until well into the 1990s. Domestic violence laws regularly went unenforced until the 1980s. Marital rape in our country was not generally outlawed in this country until the 1990s. It's been a long, hard road. Equal pay for equal work is still not enforced. Parental leave is just a dream for most women at work. But since the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973, women have at least a limited right over reproductive choice. The court's leaked decision essentially tells us that unlike almost every other democratic country in the world, in our country, women citizens and residents do not have the right over what goes on in their own bodies if the government says they don't. The history of women's oppression is long, and broken bodies and wounded spirits of countless women litter the landscape of this horrendous tale. While some of that has been limited over the last half century through the reduction of back alley or clothes hanger abortions, even that partial remedy ends with this court decision. So what do we do about this? What can we do? We do what brave women and their male allies have done for over 200 years of this struggle. Demonstrate, agitate, organize, and vote. Demonstrate, agitate, organize, and vote. If you can, get out in the street with others, or go online and speak for change. Agitate for comprehensive women's rights legislation, including a national right to reproductive choice law. Organize efforts to lobby Congress to accept the Equal Rights Amendment, which has now received the necessary ratification in 38 states, enough to become part of our Constitution. The amendment is simple. It states, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. According to most interpretations, this amendment would likely guarantee that no state could prohibit abortion, or contraception choices, or gay marriage. And it would protect transgender and non-binary rights. It's taken half a century to get ratified by the necessary states, but it now could become part of the Constitution if Congress voids the unnecessary time limit it put on it in 1972. However, neither the choice law nor the Equal Rights Amendment can get through Congress if more pro-choice people are not added in the next election. That means demonstrate, agitate, organize, and vote. Demonstrate, agitate, organize, and vote. Demonstrate, agitate, organize, and vote. It will bring us results, and it will bring us hope. I guess I'm getting old, but not too old to continue the fight for women's rights. I'm River Smith for Liberation Brew and Satyagraha Arts with a comment.